Hi, this is Jeffrey Wernick, and I'm here with Bruce Fein for another Fine Points. I'd like to wish all that are watching a very happy Memorial Day. Um, I like what Ronald Reagan had said in one of the speeches he gave to commemorate Memorial Day, which was that he hoped that he wouldn't have to be commemorating the lives of more people lost in the cause of liberty and freedom. Ronald Reagan was someone who hoped that we would basically eliminate all nuclear weapons and eliminate all the need for war. Um, and uh, and that's what he expressed as a way of commemorating Memorial Day, and I think that's the appropriate way of commemorating Memorial Day, hoping that there are not more bodies each year added to the list of people who have lost their lives for, on the most part, uh, unnecessary wars. So, uh, you know, so um, I was also trying to look for what I thought was the most uplifting Memorial Day message for this year. So I think that as I was looking through the internet, looking for Memorial Day messages that I think uh, indicate the the United States of America today, I found one that stood out as a shining example of America today and a way we communicate with each other with dignity, with grace, with humility. Um, ways that we give ourselves pride in the country and the dignity and elegance in which we behave. So I'll read the winner, and then and we open up for Bruce. So here's the winning one to express the America of today. Happy Memorial Day to all, including the scum that spent the last 4 years trying to destroy our country through warped radical left minds who allowed 21 million people to illegally enter our country, many of them being criminals and the mentally insane, through an open border that only an incompetent president would approve, and through judges who were on a mission to keep murderers, drug dealers, rapists, gang members, and released prisoners from all over the world in our country so they can rob, murder, and rape again, all protected by these USA hating judges who suffer from an ideology that is sick and very dangerous for our country. Hopefully, the United States Supreme Court and other good and compassionate judges throughout the land will save us from the decisions of the monsters who want our country to go to hell. But fear not, we have made great progress over the last 4 months, and America will soon be safe and great again. Again, happy Memorial Day and God bless America. I think it's not. I think it's easy to recognize the author of that elegant and dignified message, and this Donald Trump. So, Bruce, what do you think of Donald Trump's message to the country on Memorial Day?
Uh, I don't think that's what Abraham Lincoln was thinking in his Gettysburg Address, uh, that those who were risking that last full measure of devotion so that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth, including due process meant. Let me begin, I think, Jeffrey, by underscoring, war, it's the worst scourge of mankind because its legal architecture is to authorize first degree murder. You can kill people not in self defense. Now, sometimes that may be necessary when you're actually attacked. We all have a right of self preservation, but it's a very, very grave decision to undertake war. And that is because we all cherish um, individuals in life, and there ought to be a very high threshold before we take a life. That's why we go back to due process of law. Not only do we cherish life, we cherish liberty. And we understand that there's no individual, including presidents of the United States, who can substitute for due process. Mr. Trump does not get to decide under our system whether someone is a terrorist or not, or a murderer. We have a judicial process. It's not perfect because human beings operate it, but it's shown to be the optimal process to avoid injustice, miscarriages, which is a blight on any government. And I recurringly remind people that when we went down this route before in a similar state of hysteria in World War II against anything Japanese American or otherwise, we made 120,000 mistakes, putting these Japanese Americans who are all loyal in concentration camps without an iota of evidence other than statements by General DeWitt saying all Japanese have undiluted ties to the Emperor Hirohito, statement that John DeWitt made, General DeWitt, but he was unable to substantiate that. But we made 120,000 errors, and we made amends later on. That's what happens when you don't undertake due process. Now, I want to repeat, sometimes due process makes errors. I thought perhaps it made an error in the O.J. Simpson criminal trial. But the prospect of abandoning due process and permitting anyone, including a president, unilaterally to decide who is guilty or who is innocent of wrongdoing is the definition of a dictatorship. And that's what makes Mr. Trump's statement so problematic. If there's evidence of all of this criminality, our immigration laws authorize deporting all of them who are convicted and sentenced. But it doesn't authorize removal based upon one person's statement that something is true without any verification according to customary admissible standards in cases where evidence has to be reliable. And the whole idea, really, of the United States was to celebrate the glory of liberty, was to be celebrated over the glory of the armored knight. And unfortunately, what Mr. Trump has stated is the opposite of liberty. We certainly want to ensure that a president can remove someone who's been proved to be a criminal and not properly in the United States. But the process is you have to show evidence. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the business model, if you will, of this administration. And instead of spending time gathering the evidence, if it exists, Mr. Trump and his colleagues simply say, well, the judges are crazy, they're radical. They don't say that they're missing evidence. They're just saying, we don't have to provide evidence, is the argument. Well, you do under our Constitution. You always have to provide evidence. And that's what makes the statement so unfortunate.
Yeah, because I think one, with respect to the comment about war that you made, at the point in time when he wrote the book War is a Racket, General Lee Butler, he was the most decorated Marine in American history. Yeah. So this is not someone who was an Ivy League graduate who taught classes and wrote for the New York Times or the Washington Post. This is a guy who was in wars. He was sent to numerous locations throughout the world on behalf of the United States of America. Had enough experience in war to have no one in our history up to that point in time more decorated than him. So that should be a credible source, right?
And another William Tecumseh Sherman. General Sherman in the Civil War. These are his words. General Sherman had scruples about killing. The march from Atlanta to the sea and up to Charleston. His words: "War is hell."
Yes.
Right? War is hell.
And Smedley Butler said it's a racket. And not only did he say it's a racket, he actually did an analysis in his book, War is a Racket. It's a short book on how profitable the execution of war is. So he basically shows how much money some of these companies that were helping and support the war effort through selling stuff and making huge profits at selling stuff at prices they would never get for the same things during times of peace. So that's why he said war was a racket, because it was basically to support commercial interests. It was not necessarily to defend the United States, the homeland, liberty, and freedom. That these wars had nothing to do with it. They were all wars of choice, unnecessary wars, that were very expensive wars and where it was mostly profiteering by the military-industrial complex. And it was basically to support the military-industrial complex, which, of course, likes an empire because there's a lot more profits in being an empire than profits in a military that just defends the homeland, which kind of thing. It's kind of ironic that on this commemorating this on June 14th, who knows if he's celebrating his birthday or the army, but how ironic is it that we're going to make a big parade to celebrate our army, okay, when the founders said standing army guaranteed to have tyranny, okay? It was never designed to have a standing army. There was to spend $1 trillion on a defense budget, to have troops all over the world in a permanent army when we're not in a state of war, okay? The founder said, if the America that does that is an America that is inviting tyranny.
Yeah, and if I would add, one of the reasons, Jeffrey, for the Second Amendment, the guaranteeing the right to keep and bear arms, to have a well-regulated militia, because it was anticipated that there was the militia. The common person, if we were invaded, would come to defend the homeland. We didn't need a standing army.
Right.
We didn't have a standing army when we defeated the British in the Revolutionary War. And the British at that time was at the summit of their empire, right? They had staggering more money. They had staggering more soldiers. Ships and whatever outnumbered ours by a huge percentage. But the difference was we're fighting for our country and liberty. They were not. They were fighting for a king. And they had to even use Hessians, mercenaries, to fight for them because they didn't have the loyalty of their people, since they didn't have any role, maybe a marginal role in electing parliamentarians, but basically the king could do no wrong. Still was the governing theme, in Great Britain. And we prevailed. 3 million on a little small part of the Atlantic coast defeated the British. And that's what we need to understand. If you have genuine loyalty of the people for your country, that's the greatest human capital you can have. And if they're willing to give and risk their lives for the country, they will win, because that is what gives, that's what I call, gives the essential morale esprit that's critical in every war. That's why, in some sense, we were defeated in Vietnam. It wasn't our war. The Vietnamese, right or wrong, said, hey, it's our country. And they came down in wheelbarrows. We had all the advantages of money, technology, even the napalm, even My Lai, and we still lost. And we can never forget that. It's the human capital being willing, because of love of country, to risk your life that's going to determine the outcome of wars.
I agree, and that was so. This is how far we move towards a state of tyranny when we're celebrating our military. This is not a plate where we're celebrating our state militias getting together and celebrating, a real people's army, compromised by each state and their militias, and a different vision of what a commander-in-chief was, given the fact that for state militia, the commander-in-chief for each militia was their governor. So I think, again, this is unfortunately what point you get back to is that people don't really know much about American history and don't know much about the Constitution and our founding documents and our founding principles that are embedded in the words of our founding generation, and why we had this revolution to begin with and what people were fighting for. So,
Jeffrey, I want to underscore that we're not impugning the motives, the loyalty of those who are in the armed forces.
No.
These people are willing to risk their lives for the country, and that is commendable. It's the leadership that's corrupted. It is the leadership that uses them as cannon fodder. It is the leadership that says, yours not to reason why. You just die no matter what, Mm-hmm. And I want to underscore that. I want to salute those who have signed up and been willing openly to risk that last full measure of devotion. But we have to remember the leadership is the one that we have to attack. And again, I don't think Jeffrey and I are not pacifists. We believe you have a right in self-defense to fight. But
Yeah.
self-defense means you're imminently endangered, physically, your life or your limb. Self-defense is not saying, well, 30 years from now, some country could get angry and we need preemptive warfare because we can't take a risk that a mushroom cloud will appear on top of Tehran sometime in the year 2050. That destroys the whole idea of self-defense. It has to be imminent. You can make up an excuse if you have a sufficiently fervent imagination for anything catastrophic happening in 15, 17, 18, 25 years. Who knows what would happen? They would develop X, Y, Z. And then that reason why I think, as an analogy, Jeffrey, when we think about the self-defense as a defense in domestic situation, you cannot defend yourself for killing someone by saying, well, I thought in 5 years' time he was going to develop a real great skill in boxing. He was going to come and smack me in the head and kill me. That doesn't work. You have to show, in order to have the defense cognizable, that the danger is imminent. Right. It's going to happen suddenly before you have a chance to react. It is not preemptive. Well, who knows what could happen? We start wars. Once you're into the preemptive theory, you can fight wars all over the world anytime you want.
I think in Vietnam, we had about 500,000 troops at one point in time.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And the theory was we sent 500,000 troops. How many Americans died in that? Or 40, 50?
56,000, something like that.
Yes. So, and this was supposedly to stop the domino theory, right? Yeah. If we lose Vietnam, we would become a communist country. So we lost Vietnam. What happened after that? Did the Vietnamese then conquer the rest of the world? Or is Vietnam now a reasonably capitalist country, even though I think I read that Trump is doing a golf course in Vietnam.
Yeah. Moreover, Jeffrey, they're a semi-ally. The Vietnam now is a semi-ally of the United States. We're protecting them from the Chinese and the South China Sea. So, well, we spent 10 years.
How much money did we spend? So think about how many lives were lost. Okay, on a bullshit theory that people, the fear that stole, and which is basically the premise of almost all war is to sell, get people to be afraid, and then have them surrender their liberties because they're frightened and they think that it's an existential threat. Like we got to kill them over there or they'll kill them over here. I guess Saddam Hussein's goal was to send a military to invade the United States. Was there any evidence that he had weapons of mass destruction?
No.
Did we find any plans of him planning to invade the United States?
His greatest terror was Iran, not the United States. In fact, he stated under questioning before he was sentenced that he had to make up at least some statements suggesting he had WMD to deter Iran from invading. That was what it was about. And he never thought our intelligence community would be so stupid as to not understand that's what he needed to prevent Iran, which is a much bigger country in terms of resources and population, from invading. And they historically had been adversaries for decades, if not longer. And he said, how could you be so dumb?
So we fought the first war we fought, major war that we fought, well, I don't know if you call Korea that, after World War II was Vietnam. We were there for 10 years, lost 50, 60,000 people. We sent 500,000 people over there. We don't know how many people were permanently impaired by mental illness as a consequence of the war, and all based upon a false premise, a lie, a bullshit, whatever people want to call it. So then after 9/11, we basically create a boogeyman out of Saddam Hussein, as if he was the one responsible for 9/11, and getting rid of him would create this miracle in the region where every country would be an enlightened democratic region. So we went into Iraq. We spent a number of years there. We killed a lot of people, and we had a country that probably might be more hostile to us today than before the war in Iraq. Just different names, but the relationship has not gotten better. It's not a it's not an example, textbook example that people are saying is here's how to do nation building, and here's this wonderful democracy called Iraq, and look how successful we had after all the money we spent. So after Iraq, we said, well, since Iraq was such a success, let's go into Afghanistan, okay, and let's spend all this time in Afghanistan. So because we're going to defeat the Taliban. So at the end of the day, it seems like the Taliban defeated us, because we left and we turned over the country to the Taliban, who were not even running the country at the time we went in. So we left Afghanistan in worse shape than we entered. And how much money did we spend on this? So at what point in time, I don't know really. Sometimes I get very frustrated at really the cognitive ability of the American public. At what point, why would anyone believe anything these people in Washington have to say, who are consistently trying to instill fear in us? We fight these stupid wars. We spend so much money fighting these stupid wars. People die for no reason whatsoever. We commit atrocities in all these locations. Of course, Americans don't care, because they're not Americans. So if kids are dying elsewhere, who cares? If we're bombing innocent civilians, I mean, the Brown University has estimated that millions died that were non-combatants, in the Middle East since the war on terror was a war on terror. It was our war terrorizing a group of people, who on the most part, had no tremendous ill will toward the United States and represented no imminent existential threat to the United States. Yet we killed millions in the process.
Let me I think amplify a couple things, Jeffrey, that I think are important. One, Vietnam wasn't the first. The first was Korean War, which Harry Truman called a police action. This was before millions died. 3 million Chinese came in. General MacArthur wanted to radiate all of Korea so nothing could grow for the next 50 years, and it was fired by President Truman because he wanted to bomb across the Yalu River into China, which could have given us a land war in China. But I want to go back to this. It's not an accident that at that time, especially after World War II, where we were the number one superpower, immediately afterwards, we were the only country that had an atomic bomb. It took the Soviet Union a couple more years to develop one. That we developed, even building on earlier, we decided, hey, let's be the duplicate, let's be the successor to the British Empire. And that means we need to go everywhere in the world. And one of the things that happened shortly after the Korean War was President Eisenhower, he had commissioned what's called the Doolittle Report. Doolittle was an Air Force general, I believe. And the Doolittle Report, the gist of it said, we have a world global enemy that is going to destroy us unless we imitate the enemy. We have to convince Americans no longer can we ever play by rules of decency, liberty, fair play. We have to imitate the enemy to defeat the enemy. And it's really quite alarming when you read it, because that's how you get defeated yourself. Because you sacrifice your liberty, your due process. Why you have a separate country if you're just going to be a carbon copy of the enemy? And when we go forward since that time, and we underscore as well, the Korean War was a presidential war. Congress never declared war. It was as we speak today, we still don't. The war is still ongoing. We have a truce, but there's never been a peace treaty signed. And if we even think about Iraq, democracy building, as we are talking today, Jeffrey, Iraq is still in a state of war with Israel from 1948. We still have troops in Iraq. I don't think we really know what they're supposed to be doing there. But the other thing that happened after the invasion of Iraq, because it elevated the Shia, Iran has Iraq as a wholly owned subsidiary. And we claim Iran is part of the axis of evil. Well, we're the one who strengthened Iran by attacking Iraq. Iraq was a cost-free deterrent of Iran hegemony.
That was the Reagan policy towards Iraq and Iran, was to keep them
shooting at each other. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right.
So
Let both of them lose. Yeah, a war that you wanted both losers to be involved. And anyway, this was the stupidity again. But it isn't just the same thing we see in Somalia, in Libya, elsewhere. You wake up a new day, then we're in the Yemen. We find we're at war with the Houthis one day, and who knows we'll be in war with the Solomon Islands the next day because China's built a road or something like that. And again, I want to underscore, it doesn't mean that we should be pacifists. There are genuine interests that we are entitled to defend, but we need to recognize the limits, and that the reason why we don't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy is not because they're not monsters. It's because we know we'll only make the situation worse. We do not have the brains, the skill, the virtue to turn Afghans into Canadians. And we got to be realistic about that. And our influence should be the influence of example. It's not going to make the world perfect, but it'll make it better than all the alternatives. And as you're pointing out, Jeffrey, we should learn. I mean, don't we understand? We go to Vietnam, we go to Iraq, we go to Yemen, we go to Libya, we go to Somalia. These are all completely failed states. We did nothing other than aggravate the situation. And the problem of going abroad in search of monsters destroyed. Not only do we not accomplish anything, but we destroy the liberties at home. I mean, right now, because of the war on terror, nothing that we do escapes the eye of the National Security Agency. They intercept our emails, they intercept our phone conversations. It's all secret. Due process is compromised, and we see that in the immigration area, but just not there. The rule of law is compromised because we no longer have transparent government, which is the greatest deterrent to wrongdoing. Presidents, whether it's Trump or Obama or Bush or Biden, executive privilege. We're not going to tell you what we're going to do. It's classified information. And that's a recipe for a complete dictatorship, which is where we're headed. And it is not just a Trump phenomenon. I can guarantee everyone watching this program, the succeeding president is not going to give back a single power that President Trump has exercised unless Congress gets a spine and says, Professor President, we are impeaching and removing you if you do that. It's the nature of the institution. It's not the personalities that we need to be worried about here. And the nature of the executive branch going back thousands of years, it will grab all power it can as soon as you give it a chance.
Yeah. During the Reagan administration, a lot of countries that had been communist countries or socialist countries entering when Reagan first became president, converted to sort of created a constitution and created maybe I can't really call them capitalist countries, but at least they no longer embraced communism and socialism. Now, when Reagan accomplished this, did he accomplish this through threatening 50 to 100% tariffs? Was he going to invade all these countries? Or did he set a role model where the dollar got very strong, where investment flowed into America, and a president who said, I'm going to have enough military to keep America safe, but ultimately, what we're selling is, this is the American dream, and we're going to lead by an example, and we hope other countries follow the example, and other countries chose to follow the examples. So did he threaten Gorbachev and insult Gorbachev every single day, calling him insane or whatever? Or did he build a level of trust through communication with them? I think Reagan said peace through strength, but the point was to have peace, not to have war, but to have peace.
Yeah, and I think, Jeffrey, that's why the Strategic Defense Initiative, whether you agree or not as it's a possibility, it was defense.
Yes.
It wasn't strategic offense where you turn space into a weapon or moon into a weapon and go use things to destroy other people with preemptive wars. Defense is defense. And that's why I always say we need invincible self-defense. And I don't object to spending money on defending ourselves against an attack. It's right. The stupidity in wasting money doing these preemptive wars over and over and over again. That needs to be, one, it's got to be stopped because we simply can't afford it anymore. And secondly, it just creates enemies. I style it this way, Jeffrey. It's like a defense policy that searches the globe for a hornet's nest, smashes the hornet's nest open, and then complains that the hornets are trying to sting them and says, now I need $1 trillion to prevent the sting. Well, why don't you just not stop cracking open the hornet's nest? That's an easy, cost-free way to prevent the attack. But, no, you got to have some excuse, some boogeyman to justify $2 trillion defense budget.
Yeah. And Reagan at one point in time did make a decision to try and see if the United States military could go in and help facilitate peace in the region. He sent troops to Lebanon when they had a civil war, hoping that he could pacify the country. All the best intentions. And what happened? There was an attack against the troops. A whole bunch of troops died. And what did Reagan say? Did he get on national TV and say, I'm going to nuke those, motherfuckers or something like that? No, he said, I made a mistake. Yeah. This is not the role. We of course we want world. We want peace, but this is not a good way to use force or peacekeeping troops. The parties there have to want it. We can't force it upon anyone. So he got out. Okay. Did people say, "Oh, look how weak Reagan is. I'm not going to respect America anymore. America sucks. Look at this president. A few terrorists in Lebanon come and they throw the United States. The United States comes running around. I'm sure Gorbachev said, I'm now going to not negotiate. I'm Reagan. I'm waiting for your white flag to surrender to us. So I don't think anybody saw that strength. It's strength to know when you've done the wrong thing and you acknowledge it. That's not weakness. That's strength. That's self-confidence. Okay. So that's what Reagan projected as a president, a strong United States, a self-confident country. And when you're really strong and you're really self-confident, you acknowledge mistakes and you behave with humility. Okay. Humility comes with real self-confidence. So not boastfulness, and not being a braggart, and not being a bully. That does not come from self-confidence. So, Reagan, that Reagan projected a self-confident America, and the self-confident America can admit its limitations. So, and then countries said, I want to ally myself with the United States, and I'm going to throw away capitalism. Really is much better than socialism and communism. So I want freedom. I want to be able to make choices for myself. And Reagan and along with Thatcher, were two great spokespersons for a classical liberal view of the world. And many people found that classical liberal view of the world, compelling. And that was to say the world. And he did it by setting an example. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, but I think Jeffrey, that even if people don't accept the example, and it may be not because the majority doesn't want it, but sometimes they don't get their way because you've got tyrants and evil people, so they don't have any free votes. We need to remember we can control our own destiny, and it doesn't matter if other people decide, and for whatever reasons they're under dictatorships. We need to make certain that we restrain ourselves. We still continue to provide an example. When we provide an example in 1776 and 1787, monarchies all throughout Europe were shaken. We had the French Revolution soon after, but other countries didn't have French revolutions for a long time. But we need to, again, have the humility to recognize we were extraordinary in 1776 in proclaiming these philosophical principles that had really never had traction in the history of the world. It wasn't commonplace. Government by the consent of the governed. We're all born with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the right to overthrow tyrannical regimes. This was truly pioneering. And it's also said this was a miracle. It's at biblical proportions, because never before had people taken away power from monarchs, dictators, emperors, whatever, and said, we're going to govern ourselves. So we need to recognize that we're clearly an exception to the rule. And we have to be wise enough to recognize that you have to fight and be alert as citizens if you're going to secure and maintain this exception. It's not the ordinary course of things for this species. Human beings naturally gravitate without education towards rulers, single rulers, emperors, kings, queens, whatever. You go back and look historically in religions, they're all one person decides everything. And people are inclined to accept that because they want a roadmap into heaven and they don't have to make very, very difficult moral choices. But we were different. We said we wanted the dignity of individuals to march their own drummer. And that's going to persist only if we remain vigilant and see where we're headed with these extravagant claims of government omnipotence, and they tell us what to do when we go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. We are an exception, and we need to recognize that exception is only kept, as Benjamin Franklin said, if you're vigilant as a citizen and becoming engaged in protest when you see laws are being violated, when our liberties are being ridiculously, compromised, to fight these stupid wars who have no point whatsoever. I mean, ask anybody, I think, Jeffrey, on this program, why are we fighting the Houthis? What's the end game? Where is it? If you don't have an end game, you shouldn't be involved in that war. And unfortunately, these things in Congress is AWOL. And the reason why we need, especially today, citizen activism is because that's the only way you can get Congress to do its job and restore our country as it was conceived in 1787 and before in 1776.
And I'll go back to the other comments about also due process.
Yeah.
And what continues to be this debate for the right of the president, who seems to not be complying with court orders. So he's a rogue, lawless president, while they keep talking about that and no one is above the law. They clearly don't really believe that. It's just as long as everybody's above the law who's a friend of theirs, and then if you're an enemy, then you're going to be subject to the persecution of the law. But it seems to be the case. One point I'd like to make a couple of points. One is, if you look at what Marco Rubio is saying now, so we sent people over without the appropriate due process to Sudan. The courts say you have to take it back. Rubio responds saying you're interfering again with foreign policy. Everyone watching this, pay attention to this, because what does it mean? It means if he would take a boatload of citizens to the country and sent it there, getting them back. So don't people think the fact is that argument is not for the fact that they're illegals. It's that we sent people to a foreign location, and the act of now asking for those people back because a mistake was made is something that is now interfering with foreign policy, and it's a sole prerogative of the president. So I want everyone to understand that right now, if you believe Marco Rubio's statement, if you support Marco Rubio's statement, you're supporting the concept that anyone in the country, anyone in the country can be picked up, sent to Sudan, and that government and that our government would then tell the country, sorry, nothing we can do about it. Maybe it was a mistake that they're there, but now it's interfering with foreign policy. So it's not unique to sending illegals over there. Anyone could be sent over there because that's what their statement now. Once we have Americans in a foreign country, that basically that becomes the purview of the president as supposedly the only arbiter of foreign policy. And given the fact that supposedly that's in the sole exclusive purview of the executive branch, that no other branch can check that behavior, that there is no check and balance on that behavior. That's a monopoly owned by the president to use their discretion. So that means anyone, enemies can be shipped over there. Political enemies can be shipped over there, and you could just call them domestic terrorists. I could just throw out the name. You're a domestic terrorist. There's already outrage about how the Biden administration had defined people as domestic terrorists, and people should be outraged by it, how these are domestic terrorists. But basically, what if Biden would have gone a step further and said, you're a domestic terrorist, and you're so because I called you one, and I'm sending you to Sudan. What would people be outraged? Well, now basically Marco Rubio says the president has the authority to do that. Anyone who the administration thinks defines themselves as a terrorist, whether domestic, or foreign terrorist, anyone without any due process, just by being called that by the right person in the executive branch, means you could get picked up on their word, sent to a foreign country, never face a court, never have a trial, and this is what the government is justifying. Right now, people think, oh, the bad guys, they're doing it. No, they're giving people think that's what James Madison was thinking about. What I want to do is I want to give the president even more powers than the British Parliament gave King George. So that's why it really is frustrating. How moronic do you have to be to believe that they fought the resolution? Because their argument was King George didn't have sufficient power. Okay, we overthrew the king because we wanted to replace it with a more powerful king, and that's why we fought the American Revolution, because we were not happy with the fact that we had a king, who was not using all the power. We want to give even more power to it, because if you think about this, the argument here is to give more power to the president than the Parliament gave to the king.
Yeah, and Jeffrey, it's even worse than what you've described, and it goes back to at least 9/11. Every president since 9/11, perhaps before covertly, has claimed and exercised, probably not as often as we know because of classified information, the power to play prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner to kill anybody on the planet that he says in secret could be a national security threat, including U.S. citizens. We know that it happened to the U.S. citizen, the teenage son of Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen. We just exterminated him, wiped him off, right? He's sitting having dinner with a friend. There was no due process. He wasn't charged with anything. There was no accountability when their efforts to sue President Obama, who was the one who issued the order, said state secret, sorry, we can't tell you why we decided to exterminate a U.S. citizen. And once you have that power, even if it's exercised, at least at present, relatively infrequently, everything else is a subordinate power. If you tell a president you can kill anybody you want without accountability, I mean, you're basically endowing the president to play God. There's no evidence required. It's just, sorry, we made a mistake. And it's just, that's why, and the reason why I make this observation is we need to disabuse the audience to think this is only a Donald Trump problem. It's a problem that emerged before Donald Trump. It's going to far out survive Donald Trump unless we regain liberty. And it's not a Republican or Democrat problem. It's a problem of the country and the executive branch out of control, because we are deciding that our real glory is being empire, to be able to go anywhere, invade any sovereignty, drop any drone, kill anybody without any purpose whatsoever. And that makes us great. It's a throwback a little bit to Hillary Clinton, who was one of the architects of the crazy war in Libya. We saw he died, trying to repeat Julius Caesar and exulting over the death of Muammar Gaddafi. Really? That's what the United States is about, to replicate Julius Caesar? No, we want to get away from Julius Caesar. But anyway, the remarks are just to underscore this is a much deeper disease than just a Donald Trump disease.
And also going back to his description of the people, James Madison, again, we've talked about in the past, when he gave his report to Congress with respect to the
Alien Enemies Act. Yeah.
He called one group cohort alien friends and the another cohort alien enemies. An alien enemy was basically someone who was a surrogate as a state actor, when that state actor had basically declared war or invaded the United States of America. So if there were people here who were part of like kind of the application of it during World War II, we were at war with Japan, so the assumption was every Japanese was a state actor, supporting the war effort of the Japanese. That was the pretext for them all being put into concentration camps, detention camps, whatever word people want to use. I guess detention camp sounds nicer than a concentration camp, but they were concentration camps.
Well, let me put a footnote on that, Jeffrey.
An alien friend. Let me just. An alien friend was somebody in the country who was committing a crime. Okay, and that they would be adjudicated upon that. But that's what Madison called alien friends to distinguish. He wanted to be very clear that an alien enemy is not someone who came to the country, and was not a citizen and committed illegal acts. Criminals were classified under Madison's explanation, and he gave the explanation so it would be clear the application of alien enemies. So he wanted to be clear that the word alien enemy would not be abused. So that's why he made it clear very explicitly. He talked about somebody that comes into the country, not a citizen, they commit crimes, okay? They commit crimes as an independent agent for their sole benefit, just because they're a criminal, okay? That was classified as alien friends. Not that he really thought they were friends, but he was trying to illustrate a point of, if I have to distinguish to make sure what a friend and an enemy is, so we don't abuse the concept of what an enemy is. So, because he didn't want the concept of just a criminal is being considered an alien enemy for the application of the Alien Enemies Act. Yeah. So, so the conditions to qualify for being an alien enemy that would then have the due process taken away from you, okay, was meant to be a very extreme condition, meant that you were at war with a country, and you were concerned that a whole bunch of people from the country you're at war with had people here who were basically as agents on behalf of that country, fighting a war against you as they came here, accepting the hospitality of the country, but they're not really hospitable. They're allied with their governments at home who are in active war against the United States, and they're aiding and abetting that war effort.
Yeah, I wanted to add on the Japanese American concentration camps to show how cynical the government can be. And I've spoken to those. I belong to a group that celebrated the survivors of those who had family in these concentration camps. One, Jeffrey, you were permitted to go east out of the concentration camps because the real reason for their employment was not because there was any real fear of sabotage or espionage, but the discrimination, the hostility, antipathy towards Japanese Americans on the West Coast, what we would call battleground states, was so great. Hey, we got to do this because we're looking at it was an electoral ploy. If you went, you could go out of the concentration camps if you went east, not west. The second thing is that even J. Edgar Hoover said this is totally unnecessary. And when the Justice Department was searching for some kind of excuse they could relate to the U.S. Supreme Court as to justify the absence of due process, the argument came forth: to the Occidental eye, all Japs look alike. We can't do individualized justice. They all look alike. We've heard that before, right?
Right.
And therefore, we have to stick him in concentration. I mean, it is about as cynical as you can get. A third step here. By 1944, when we were clearly on the way to victory over Japan, the military told President Roosevelt, we do not need those camps anymore. It's ridiculous. He kept the Japanese Americans past the November election because he said, well, look at, if we're going to have these Japanese Americans returning to the West Coast, that's going to be electorally problematic for me. I mean, that's the kind of reasoning that goes on, behind closed doors to show the complete phoniness, the fabrication of these dangers, and underscores again the criticality of due process. I underscore again, it's not perfect because human beings aren't perfect, but the whole principle of Western civilization is built on the idea it's better that we protect any innocent from being sanctioned who should not be sanctioned, that maybe a handful of the wrongdoers go free. If we have to choose, we choose in favor of liberty. That's the difference between Western civilization and all others.
Yes, thank you for those words, Bruce. What other topics are on your mind today on Memorial Day that you'd like to talk about?
I mean, one of the things that comes to mind, you remember, President Trump spoke at West Point. And you remember he had earlier in his first term, he called the U.S. soldiers who had died in World War I, Belleau Wood, as according to his chief of staff, suckers and losers. So it's kind of odd that he's be speaking at West Point. But I think that his remarks there show, I think, that we have someone who has clueless about what he wants to accomplish in foreign affairs other than, narcissism. He says correctly, I believe, at the outset, we shouldn't be telling other countries how to run their business. Failure after failure shows, okay, he's got some recognition that we are in these places without any ability to turn Afghans into Canadians. And then he goes on and says it's the mission of the U.S. Army to spread democracy around the world with guns. I mean, wait a minute, So he sounds like George Bush. We're going to eliminate evil from the planet in his second inaugural address. So I think that.
How does that work? Spreading democracy with weapons. How does it work?
Yeah, well, at the end of it.
How does it work? Are you support democracy? No, I'm going to send you to South Sudan, and so all the people who don't support democracy are in Libya or South Sudan or El Salvador, and then the only people remaining are those that support democracy. I mean, how do you do it? You're gonna get Elon Musk is going to check everybody's social media account that they get all this information and then make a judgment about who supports democracy on Trump's terms of his definition of democracy. Which basically means you have to swear fidelity to him. So that's the system we have today. Is you got to swear. I mean, that's basically the issue. And hasn't been an issue. Is this point about this war now between the executive claim of this unitary executive versus the Congress being able to commit agencies and have those agencies have some sense of independence, so that they're not just they don't just become partisan tools. So the founders warned against partisanship. So the point of avoiding partisanship has been to have a bunch of administrative agencies where you have a certain people appointed by Republicans and certain by Democrats. So there's an ideological balance. So there's not an abuse, and it doesn't become everything at the discretion of the president. And it seems that right now, basically, the argument of the executive branch is once Congress creates an administrative agency, that administrative agency is controlled exclusively by the president without any check and balances. They're just giving more power. The irony about this is that the people that have advised the administration were the ones who were advocating for ending the administrative state, and now they want to seem to have the most powerful administrative state accountable just to one individual. So I mean, it's not even an administrative state; it's just a presidential state where basically you don't even need the administrative body; they're just people following the instructions of the president. So it's like I want to give an infinite amount of grants to Hillsdale College, and I want to bankrupt Harvard. So and I will bankrupt any institution that has a professor that says something I don't like. So I mean, that's what we're inviting with this interpretation of the Constitution. We're giving
Jeffrey,
the type of.
If we could pause for a second, Jeffrey, and I
Sure.
excuse me for interrupting, and that is because there's a great, I think, misunderstanding of the Madisonian concept of separation of powers. And it wasn't to create a system where there was kind of Chinese wall between the legislative
Right.
and executive and judicial branches. There was some overlap. His idea was that no one branch should dominate, exercise a controlling influence, or his words, over another. And if we just think in the basic Constitution, there isn't this Chinese wall. For instance, in the legislative process, you need majorities in the House and the Senate, but the president has a qualified veto. So the president has some role in the legislative process, but he doesn't have the dominant role. In the making of treaties, the president can negotiate a treaty, but the Senate has to ratify the treaty, right? and even making it appointments have typically been executive powers. But in our Constitution, if it's a principal officer of the United States, you can nominate, but the Senate has to confirm. These are in the judicial branch. Ordinarily, the judicial branch adjudicates cases, but in certain instances, judges make appointments. For example, the appointment of independent counsels under the Independent Counsel Act, including such as Kenneth Starr, and the U.S. Supreme Court upheld that because these encroachments from a pure theory of separation didn't give any single branch a controlling influence over another. So it's wrong to say, well, listen, they exercise some executive power. That's the beginning of the question, not the end of it. So what? Is it a controlling influence? And when you're telling me to let the Consumer Product Safety Commission, have some protection against presidential removals, gives it a controlling influence over the executive branch? I mean, it's a joke, a complete joke. And that's why I think this argument for the unitary executive makes no sense. It's contrary to what Madison himself, it's contrary to the explicit design of the Constitution. If it was a unitary executive, there would be no Senate confirmation role in appointments of principal officers. There'd be no Senate role in ratifying treaties. Indeed, in these circumstances, Jeffrey, the King of England did able to operate by himself in these areas. Parliament played no role whatsoever. And that's what I want to underscore.
If you believe their definition of separation of powers, how could Pam Bondi be investigating the congresswoman from New Jersey?
Yeah, right. So that
isn't she investigating the legislative branch?
Yeah. Speech or debate clause. She could say, "I was just trying to survey, the faithful execution of our immigration laws." So that's what it's using. We have to remember that what is the goal? What is the purpose of separation of powers? Is to check limitless discretion that could encroach on our liberties. That's the ultimate lodestar. Right. And if that lodestar is advanced by deviating from a pure unitary system, you deviate. You don't sacrifice the limb to the body. The overarching goal is to make sure we're optimizing liberty by putting as many checks as we can into the system. And that's what's totally lost by this ridiculous idea that somehow by uttering a phrase unitary here, that's not, I can guarantee you, James Madison never ever used the phrase unitary executive. You always resort to the question, does this configuration advance liberty and check abuses, or does it sacrifice it? And whatever advances liberty and checks abuses is the interpretation you adopt.
I think that's a very good heuristic to evaluate everything by. Does it advance liberty, or does it limit liberty? Yeah. So, and yes, since the goal was to advance liberty, then to look at everything from that perspective. So clearly, a lot of the things that Trump and other presidents, Obama and all the presidents that precede him, their efforts are to limit liberty and to expand their own power. And Trump has just been more successful. I mean, what do you think about like his attack on Harvard and these institutions and the pretext under which he's given, of trying to take away its tax exempt status, then saying I'm not going to grant visas to any student who wants to study from abroad, who wants to study at Harvard.
These are clearly efforts, I think, that are motivated because Mr. Trump doesn't like the speech that he's hearing. If there's nothing else involved, and that's why he wouldn't go after Hillsdale College. You stand up and you clap, he's not going to oppose you, right? You say anything he doesn't like, he's going to wield everything that he has in his arsenal. And that's why you see, I think, Jeffrey, in the companion area where he's done the same thing with regard to law firms that I wouldn't join, but hey, they have a right to, advance arguments consistent with the rule of law. And then he's tried to deny them security clearances. No one's going to be hired out of your law firms because he doesn't like what their arguments are. He doesn't like their politics. Well, he has a right to oppose them in his own speech, in campaigning or whatever. You don't have the right to wield government to pummel opponent because you happen to disagree with their viewpoints. And that, I think, is clearly listen, I disagree with a whole lot of viewpoints at Harvard. I one time, when the Harvard Law Forum invited me to speak on war powers, then they disinvited me. I don't need to go, and said, well, listen, you're private. I think this is rather contrary to your inculcation of Voltaire rather than Thomas de Torquemada as what ought to be the guiding principle on the campus. But, and I went and I criticized what my alma mater was doing. That's the way the system works. You don't bring up a Cudgel by force when you don't have an argument on the merits to jeopardize the system. And I think, and let me go back again when we raised this issue of tax exemptions, because this has showed, I don't want to boast here, prescience on my part. One of the earliest issues that I encountered when I was in the Reagan administration was an argument that was made to revoke, this began under President Nixon, revoke the tax exempt status of Bob Jones University as a bona fide educational institution, even though it gave degrees, had classes, and was credited. And I said, really, this case was in the U.S. Supreme Court before we had the argument. And I said, well, what's the authority? The statute says if you're a bona fide educational institution, you get a tax exemption. And in fact, the statute was enacted in 1917, which was the heyday of Jim Crow and racism, the birth of a nation, and Woodrow Wilson's racism. So I said, Congress has authority to deny tax exempt status to any institution that's engaged in racial discrimination. Bob Jones prohibited interracial dating. Congress can do that, but it has to act with the statute. You just can't. I said, what is the executive theory to justify revoking Bob Jones' tax exempt status? I said, well, it's against public policy. Well, how do you know? I mean, it's either consistent with the law or not. Well, public policy is like the penumbra's emanations. You kind of discern it from the sky or something. I said, wait, that's not law. No, you can go to Congress. We did, and ask the statute. Anyway, the case gets to the Supreme Court, and they uphold this woolly. I said, listen, it's going to come back and haunt you. How can you say? I said, the next thing was, suppose you're violating pollution laws. Can they yank your tax exempt status for that? Can they yank your tax exempt status if you're an all girls school? There isn't any limiting principle of deciding what's public policy when you can just pull it out of the sky, saying it's a brooding omnipresence that I can see and no one else. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court ruled against us, and now Trump can use that and say, well, I think Harvard's acting against public policy. Why? Are they violating any laws? No, I just don't like it. I mean, it shows the danger of embracing a principle, I say, that lies around like a loaded weapon. It's coming back to haunt us. Even though people think, well, it was used in the first instance for a good cause, we weren't applauding any racial discrimination, but you got to still comply with the laws. There are a lot of other sanctions you can get for racial discrimination of them, but one of them was not yanking your tax exempt status unless Congress authorizes it. Anyway, that's where we are. I think that it's most unfortunate that we're in this state where lawlessness seems to be prevalent based on the theory that the ends justify the means. The ends don't justify the means. The ends, if they do justify the means, are going to destroy us as a country that cares about liberty and due process.
Yeah. We keep forgetting that the path to hell is paved with good intentions. Yeah. A lot of people have good intentions, but this is the consequences of, you might have the right intentions when you do something, but that doesn't mean that the principle you're establishing will end up leading you to heaven or to hell, that someone can take those same principles and bring you to hell. And so we don't want to give anybody that type of power. And also the ignorance regarding the law of unintended consequences. I think I think one of the economists, one of my favorite economists, Frederick Hayek, he gave a Nobel lecture, and the Nobel lecture he called "The Pretense of Knowledge." So I think that's what that's what DC suffers from, an abundance of ignorance and a pretense of knowledge. And so the reason why you trust markets are not like you talk about trusting the legal process. It's not that they're perfect. It's the fact is that they're the best mechanism for aggregating information and allocating capital. And it doesn't mean they're always right. It just means that there's nothing better. So nothing even remote. There's nothing remotely close to second best. So
I say, Jeffrey, Washington is afflicted by this disease, and maybe the disease is the wrong word, because mankind's made of crooked timber. We're going to find imperfections everywhere. Washington believes that if you can find an imperfection, you must challenge it, even if your cure is going to be way worse than the disease, because it just looks like you're doing something. That if you do nothing to try to correct, an imperfection, even if the correction is going to be worse, that shows you're callous. No, it can just show you have a brain. That if you cannot make an improvement on the status quo, leave it alone, even if it's still imperfect. And why is they can't get that in their head. Somehow they impute malignancy to you. Oh, if you're not trying to cure that, that shows you don't care. No, it just knows that you don't have the ability to lessen the evil. Just leave it there. It's still evil for sure, but that's like it's totally outside the intellectual philosophical universe of anybody in Washington, D.C.
Yes, it's they go to Washington because they think they have all the answers. They go to Washington because they suffer from hubris.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the unfortunate thing. I mean, that's what make, I think, a kind of guy like Ron Paul unique, because, to have many people who have that philosophical framework and want to go to Washington, it's the same thing. As I texted you the other day, I said, why does Massey continue wanting to be in office? I mean, I don't know what it seems to me that you're losing every single day. So and there's no path to victory. There's no path to accomplishing anything remotely close to what you hope to accomplish. What keeps you? I don't know what, and I don't mean this as a criticism of him. It's I respect the fact that there's one person who's willing to take the heat and doesn't care what epithets the president calls him, and and the threats that are made about him, and all the insults that are thrown to him, and he's willing to accept it because he's a principled person, and he's going to stick to his principles, and he's going to get demonized for sticking to his principles, which is a very sad thing. We should have respect for people who are willing to stick up to principles even at a high cost. I mean, he knows he's going to have money thrown against him, to primary him. So the easy thing would have been to just to play along. So, he could have got pats on the back. He could have had Trump donate, had directed money towards his campaign and guaranteed that he would never have had, a primary election. But no, he decided to be principled about it. And being principled is being called a grandstander. If you have a set of principles, you don't fall in line. Somebody goes and tells you what to think, and you actually have the capacity of thinking for yourself, okay? And you're there to do what you think is in the best interest of the American public, not the Republican Party, not the Democratic Party, not for the president, whichever party that is, but to represent the American people. He represented the American people. The debt is going to be a consequence, an adverse consequence to the American people, and he wanted to prevent the American people from suffering any more from the debt. We have higher interest rates, higher mortgage costs. So these are a lot of, there's a destruction of wealth, and he's trying to prevent that ongoing destruction of wealth and protect the future generations, and that should be considered commendable. Yeah. Instead, it's considered grandstanding and others, and then you get the type of vicious attacks because he has the boldness, dare him, think for himself. He's not supposed to do that. He wasn't sent to D.C. to think for himself. So he was sent there to rubber stamp whatever Trump says. I mean,
it reminds me.
I guess that's James Madison's vision of the Constitution.
Yeah, Jeffrey, it reminds me of the statement here. In Washington, no good deed goes unpunished, right? When you come here and recognize that, no good deed goes unpunished. Any valor, any genuine conscientiousness, you'll get punished for it. And the one thing that's remarkable also about Thomas Massie is that, as you pointed out, he's fighting for posterity. Even though they don't have a current vote, he doesn't want to saddle posterity with a $50 trillion national debt, which is going to gobble up a huge portion, if not all the portion of the federal budget, if we get interest rates back to 4 or 5% on 10-year treasuries. And the other thing that he's fighting for is basically, he does not want, as you were pointing out, the stupidity of these price controls and having Mr. Trump complain that Walmart or Amazon is suggesting that, if you put a 100% tariff, your prices are going to go up, and suggesting the government is going to order prices to stay low, even though it's imposed these costs that have to be borne by someone. It's going to be the consumer. I mean, it's really remarkable that a country or a campaign that legitimately attacked Kamala Harris for saying she's going to control grocery prices, no more profiteering, whatever that means, turns around and says, we're going to control the prices of anybody who imports something by telling them how much of the import tax they can pass on. They issue executive orders telling what farmers should cost, should charge their buyers or their patients. The whole idea is that of our system, especially of economic freedom, is that even though it's not perfect, the free market will have an adjustment so that it'll optimize, consumer welfare. Again, not perfect, but far superior to what any government can do. I mean, I experienced it firsthand, Jeffrey. I can still remember at this very moment walking down, this is August 15th, 1971, very young, callow, in Washington, D.C., and President Nixon announced his wage and price controls of the whole country. It was a complete disaster. I don't know whether you recall that. We had so many bureaucrats. They were setting every single wage, every single price, and every commodity: peanut butter, toilet paper, coffee, grains. I mean, it was absurd. And here we are, back to the same old stupidity. It's because they don't really. This is I think we got to understand the mentality of the politician. They really don't want you to be free. They fear that because you could make an independent judgment that they aren't worthy of being in office. So they want to control your livelihood. So they figure they can yank your chain and therefore don't get out of the line too much politically, because then we can come destroy your ability to make money. And so they're at odds. And the whole reason why we have checks and balances to prevent this kind of demon look of politicians from being effectuated by preventing government from getting into this level of granularity into your economic life.
Yes, it's people. Again, it's going back to what Hayek talked about, the pretense of knowledge. We have to understand the limitations of our knowledge. We have to appreciate the fact that we can always be wrong. We have to have the humility to accept and acknowledge and that we're constantly learning. And no one has reached the end of knowledge where there's nothing more to learn, because we know everything that needs to get known, that needs to be known, and therefore we have perfect knowledge, and we have perfect foresight into the future. We don't have perfect knowledge. We lack a lot of information. There's a lot of information asymmetry, okay? And like in if you look at people who are great considered great investors, only a very small percentage of people actually have outperformed the markets over like a 30-year period of time. Those that have not outperformed it by a significant amount. They've outperformed it, by a few percentage points, but you don't have anybody out there who is really that I'm aware of has outperformed the market by 10% a year. In trading, they might exist, but they're probably running their own money, and maintaining a very low profile, in doing so. But if you look at the public funds, most of the funds that have very good years then follow very good years with very bad years, so that over a cycle, they don't necessarily perform significantly different, than the marketplace does. So we know the exception is, people in Congress who trade on inside information. So which is still legal for them to do. So so something should probably be done about that, and they keep talking about doing something about that, but they haven't done anything about it. But but again, to the extent that people complain about Congress not changing these laws, people should not blame Nancy Pelosi. They should not blame anyone in Congress who's abused, the right they've given themselves to trade off inside information. People only have themselves to blame because they send these people back to Washington. Okay, at the end, every 2 years, every member of Congress answers to the people, and the people say, "I'm okay with you breaking the law. I'm okay with you with creating exceptions to the law for your personal benefit. I'm okay with you not doing your job. I'm okay with you not fulfilling your constitutional obligations. I'm okay with you not performing your constitutional responsibilities. Okay, I'm okay with you being dumb and corrupt. I'm okay with all of that." So ultimately, we're sending these people back to Washington, and that's why ultimately, as I said, who was enabling Trump, okay, today, and who enabled Obama and Bush, in the past, and Clinton in the past, is the American people. The American people have done it because they say we don't place liberty first. We're not constitutionalists. Okay, we're people we're people just driven by convenience. So laziness and convenience is what drives us. And so it's that, and our apathy. It's that what allows these people to behave. If a bunch of people said, I love the Constitution, I love Trump's ideology, but I don't want to break the Constitution. I don't want to. I want to deport all these people, but I want them to go through due process. And if a bunch of people just said wrote letters to their Congress people and said, you know what, I want to deport everyone, but I want to deport them all through due process. I don't want there to be abuse of the Constitution. Okay, and by the way, you should be setting tariff policy, not the president. If the president thinks it's a good idea to set these tariffs, then set these tariff policies if you think it's in the best interest of the nation. But I voted for you to do the job that the Constitution said you're responsible for doing, not to cede it to the president and let the president do whatever they want to do, and you become a spectator to this process, and the president can do whatever they want to do. So, but no, I want you to do your work. If American people fought for the Constitution, they didn't have to fight for it. All they have to do is apply it at the ballot box and say, if you don't live according to the Constitution, I don't care whether I agree with your ideology or not ideology. The main ideology is the Constitution, and we're going to penalize anyone that doesn't do it. But we don't. We hold getting our way, as you said before, Bruce,
Yeah.
the ends justify the means. So to the extent that we believe in the ends justifying the means, we don't care about the Constitution. As long as we get what we want, we don't care how we get it. Okay. And this is the support. This is what I see is, the support for Trump. That people are dissatisfied with the process, that they find dysfunctional, that they can't reach a consensus on anything. And so the absence of being able to reach a consensus on anything, I'm unhappy. I want the government to do something. And so I'm happy that a strong president's coming in, and doing the things I want. I don't care whether they're constitutional or not. I'm getting what I want. But not all the people are getting what they want, and for those that are not getting what they want, they're having their liberty taken away from them, and a liberty that's an inalienable right. We had all these years about, during the Democratic regimes where there's complaints about the censorship industrial complex that was going into social media, okay, and removing people and deplatforming them from the Twitter accounts and and their other accounts. What we see now attacking free speech is much worse. It's criminalizing it. Okay, the government is going after you and figuring out how they can destroy your life rather than having a platform. One thing is sitting back and saying, "Gee, I want you to remove this Harvard professor, from Twitter." This is now instead of trying to remove the Harvard professor from Twitter, they're trying to bankrupt Harvard. So so the party that said the government was weaponized against us, is now okay with its weaponization, and the people who were complaining about being victims are now the predators. So,
Jeffrey, I apologize for interjecting here, but I want to give the audience 3 examples of showing
go ahead.
that the system still works if you're engaged in my lifetime. One, at one point during the Watergate investigation under Richard Nixon, he flirted with the idea, like Trump has, well, I'm not going to comply with the order to hand over White House tapes. And 30,000 American citizens sent telegrams to Congress. The executive said, no, you got to comply. The rule of law governs. Within days, Nixon changed his mind and he said, okay, I'll hand over the tapes. We know the aftermath. A second occasion came when President Obama, he wanted to have the Congress declare war against Syria in 2011. The American people wrote in all sorts of emails, phone calls, whatever, to Congress, said, no way, we do not want another war, and Congress blocked it. He said, we are not going to declare war. In fact, the bill to declare war didn't even get out of committee. And then the third instance was the Troubled Assets Relief Program, TARP. This is a ridiculous effort by Trump to George W. Bush to bail out the banks so that, and the penalty was to be paid by homeowners who got their houses foreclosed. But anyway, this was a bailout. And I saw the American people, when the bill was in the House side, overwhelmingly, I was in Congress itself at the time, sending in emails, phone calls, no bailout. And the House voted it down. They changed their mind later. But again, it shows that this is just not academic ideas that Jeffrey is expounding. If you actually act in this way, the system still works. The difference between those occasions and now, there's just a stunning silence. You go to members of Congress and they say, we're not hearing anything from our constituents. Why should we care? And that's because no one's contacting them. You have, in today, you have email, you have phone, you have even faxes in some instances. In most virtually every district, there's a local office you could walk in without any advance meeting or schedule and just say, I want X, Y, or Z to happen. So it's really, we are our own worst enemy by being passive and not exercising our rights. And it's really quite stunning. Somebody like me, I go abroad regularly and see people risking their lives so they would have a chance to vote, whether it's in Myanmar, China, Sri Lanka, or other places. Here we have the right to vote and to express our views to Congress, and they're not even utilized. Other people would be doing backflips if they had that opportunity in their own country.
Yeah, the ultimate, the responsibility of upholding the Constitution, the ultimate responsibility resides in the people ourselves. The assumption should always be, which the founders believed, is that whoever you grant power to, they're going to want more. Okay, that's why there was this competition. It's, again, as you said, is when there were 3 branches. They're not equal branches. There are 3 branches in a system of checks and balances, but they were not equal branches. They're just 3 branches embedded in a system of check and balances where, to some extent, they were competing with each other. Yeah. They were competing with each other to make sure that they put limits on each other. And this competition was supposed to then produce the limits. It wasn't, as you said, this is my lane, this is your lane, and that's your lane, and everyone had a monopoly in their lane. Okay, that's as it's being described today. That's how it's being described today. 3 branches set up, and they each would operate independently of each other, where there was no accountability between one branch and the other, which is just a stupid, moronic interpretation of the Constitution. But you get people who will say whatever they want to say to produce the result that they want to produce. So unfortunately, that's human nature. Is you get people who will justify whatever's convenient for them, and they'll figure out whatever argument produces the result that decide what they want, and they don't care whether they're telling the truth or not. They just don't care. So, and they're not held accountable for it. So the American people should not expect any president, any elected representative in Congress, or the courts to do their job if the people don't do their job. And the only way for people to do the job is to make sure you don't send anyone up. If everyone has their ideology, you can have their ideology. I love tariffs. Okay, I love everything ideological. I want to deport I don't want anyone immigrating to this country, at all. And this is my version of what make America great again. Everybody's entitled to their opinion of what they think America great again. But they're not entitled to accomplish it in an unconstitutional way. Okay, they're just not. No one in this country is entitled to, and we should hold the Constitution more sacred than anything else, than partisan loyalty. If we really want to be loyal to America, if we really claim to be loyal to America, okay, you're loyal to the Constitution. And if you're not loyal to the Constitution, you hate America. Okay, so that's my opinion. You hate America if you don't willing to behave on the contract that binds us together, which is that we all respect the process, that the ends do not justify the means. Okay, that we focus on the means, and if the means on a regular basis produce bad outcomes, then we through a process of consensus, we change the means and come up with a better process that improves upon the process that we have right now. But because a process fails, doesn't mean we replace a failed process with a tyrant. We replace a failed process with a better process. We're supposed to learn. When processes fail, we sit back and say, how do we design a better process? That should be the conversation that we should have. This isn't working the way we hope it to work. What is the process that we think will work better?
Yeah. And I want to supplement what you said, Jeffrey, with 2 points. One is that because we have a constitution, there are rights that are protected against the outcome of any election, as what Justice Robert Jackson said in the famous flag salute case. Your rights under the Bill of Rights does not turn on the outcome of any election. There's certain things that the framers thought were so important, even if every person in the United States wanted to suppress your right to free speech, they can't do it. You're still protected by free speech. The second thing is that the Constitution can be amended. The framers did not believe they were infallible. George Washington's farewell address said, listen, if experience shows there needs to be improvements, there's an amendment process under Article 5. Indeed, the Bill of Rights was the first amendment process, and it passed and was ratified relatively quickly in a couple of years. So does it have supermajorities? Yes, because we need to be cautious about believing we're superior to the really quite extraordinary number of brilliant people at the Constitutional Convention, but they're not infallible. And therefore, we have supermajorities that required. We've had 27 amendments to the United States Constitution. One went with 13 weeks, the 18-year-old voting rights amendment. Some take much longer, but because there's a deliberative process. But the reason why we want to have supermajorities is that one advantage of making the Constitution relatively stable is it enables us to plan. And we can predict, okay, we don't think that the Constitution is going to be changed, like the next day's newspaper or something, next day's headline, because there are safeguards against having it destroyed over a whim on a particular political whim that happens, but it's going to be transient within a few hours. So providing stability is different than being a petrified forest. It's not a document that says can never change. It just says there's certain thresholds that have to be met to have change, because there is a value in stability, not permanent stability, but having super majorities required to change things. And say then the Constitution has never, ever said anything is off limits to amendment except the equal representation of the states in the Senate. And then an ancient one said you couldn't prohibit the slave trade before 1808. Every other provision of the Constitution you can amend. And the argument is, if you don't have the consensus to get the amendment, maybe it's not a good amendment. Maybe the process is not flawed. Maybe your amendment is flawed. Anyway, that's where we have, and that's been the best Constitution that's been conceived by mankind over thousands of years. It's not perfect. Nothing is, because we're dealing with imperfect human beings, but we shouldn't throw it away. We know what's going to happen when you have dictators. A lot of experiential evidence on that score. We're going to lose all of our liberties. We're going to lose due process. We're going back to the days before the American Revolution of July 4, 1776. where the king could do no wrong, and we suffered.
I think that that's a very excellent point, Bruce. It's almost all your points are always right on, and thank you for them. But I think when people say the Constitution, that's also another flawed argument. When people say, as you pointed out, the people who wrote the Constitution did not think they wrote a perfect document. But to the extent that it's imperfect, there is one way of perfecting it, of making it better. That's through the amendment process. We have to respect the fact is that the founders said, we came up with a document. We had the Articles of Confederation. Didn't work out well. We said, this is better than the Articles of Confederation. It's like Jefferson talked about. You have a document, you think it's flawed, and society learns, and society comes up with trying to do something better after learning that whatever they did at one point in time had its imperfections. And because you're a learning society, you can perfect things over time. So we went from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, and then you're right, as you said. Then we know the Constitution is a flawed document. We want to make sure the Constitution exists with a Bill of Rights. So we append the Bill of Rights to the Constitution because we're concerned that maybe the Constitution in and of itself might not preserve liberty the way we want liberty preserved. So we're gonna codify it, and make sure that it's clearer through these Bill of Rights. So it's the fact is that all these things require the consent and will of the people. That if we're going to change things, you're not going to have a judge change things. You're not going to have anyone from any of the three branches unilaterally change anything. What you have to get is you have to go back and get broad consent because we don't want tyranny of the majority. So we want to make sure that if we're going to modify this document, then we're going to modify it as a federal document because that's what we're talking about, the federal Constitution. We're not talking about state constitutions. So as a federal document, we want to make sure we get, a super majority to make sure that they're in agreement with the change because we want to make sure that whatever change we're doing on behalf of everyone. And we want to make sure we have broad consensus and broad consent in doing so. It's like now, I win an election, I get 49% of the vote, and I win the election with 1/3 of the people not even voting. And I think that's a license for me that's a mandate for me to do whatever I want. And I'm not constrained by the Constitution because 49% of the people voted for me. So what kind of absurd argument is that 49% of the people voted for you, so you have a mandate? I never heard of anyone getting less than 50% and claiming they have a mandate, okay? So how does having a minority, having less than a majority give you a mandate? You get more than the other person, you got a plurality, but you didn't get a majority, and still define that as a mandate. And then you go, well, I want all these different counties, okay? Like counties are voters. So a county citizens. So, so you can try and come up with this. Well, I want 85% of the counties. So that gives me a mandate.
It's worse than that, Jeffrey, because in Franklin Roosevelt in 1936, Richard Nixon in 1972, they both won more than 60% of the vote. They didn't give them a mandate to flout the Constitution. Franklin Roosevelt couldn't pack the Supreme Court. Richard Nixon ended up being resigned because he would have been impeached, removed from office. Even at those supermajorities, if you want to try to turn those into amending the Constitution, you can. But on their own, they do not change the Constitution. And I also want to point out that, listen, even the amendment process can be flawed, but there's a cure. We ratified the Prohibition Amendment in 1919. We had about 13, 14 years, said, hey, this is not working. So we repealed the amendment. So right. We built in to, features that accommodate real life experience. They say, this is not ossified. It's not a petrified forest. You just need to be able to absorb information and alter things based upon argument. It can be done. You do not need to change the Constitution. Violate the Constitution to achieve what you want to achieve if you have a good argument and persuade others.
Right. But when you don't have a good argument, then you want to use force. To the extent that you use the tools at your disposal, and basically within our system of checks and balances, the assumption was if anybody used the tools at their disposals and ended up abusing those tools, some other branch or the people would check that, and that unfortunately is not working out very well. So we've had, and again, not unique to Trump. We don't want to say this is just jumping on Trump, but there's been it's been kind of like chronic problem now for the United States that we have. We don't really defend liberty. We don't fight for liberty. We fight for petty partisan differences. We fight to have the world shape according to our own view and vision of the world. And it's a very egocentric perspective. Is that we want the world to look like the way we want it to look like, and we reject all alternative visions of the world, and we're completely intolerant of it. And then when we complain about being the victim when the other person is in the majority, then once we're in the majority, we end up victimizing the people, and we end up behaving similar to the people doing that. And then the class of people who don't get engaged in politics are people like, on the most part, like you and me, and the libertarians, because we don't want that power. So we don't want to have that power. So we want the power to be with the people, not with the government. We don't want people looking to the government for solutions to problems. That's not the government's role. The government has a very simple role: protect the homeland, protect our liberties. That's it. That's all they're supposed to do. There's no obligation of the government to make my life better. The government's not responsible for having me save for my retirement. The government's not responsible for giving me health care. The government's not responsible for educating me. Okay, I'm responsible for my own life. That's what being a sovereign individual is you take responsibility for your own life. You don't expect anybody else to do anything. Nobody has an obligation to do anything for anyone else. You have to give people a compelling reason why engaging with you is worth their time.
Jeffrey, I would only add one small, but maybe more than small, amendment to your observations, and that is because we don't choose who our parents are. The one additional feature I would add to the government: free education. You get flunked out if you don't do your homework, because the education and the understanding of separation helps everybody, because we're all in the idea of self-government together. And because some children are born into circumstances that very much hinder their ability to have access and to be encouraged to read books and to learn and to think and to write, I would have the government establish, I would try to run schools. Anybody can come in free, but if you don't perform, you're going to get flunked out. That's your problem. That's the one additional element I think is important here, because I do think it's a common good, citizen wisdom and understanding, and recognizing when they have to put process above their own particular outcome. Other than that, I would agree with every single syllable that you uttered.
Well, my concern about education is we have more indoctrination and inculcation in education. So
right.
if we had schools that actually educated people, I would agree with you, Bruce. But I found my academic experience. I think I've told the story before, but when I was a student, I would sit in class and I would bring logic puzzles and I'd bring books and I'd read books because I found the coursework easy for me. So I would get close to perfect scores in all my exams, and I would be sitting in class and I would never be paying attention to the teacher. But why did I have to be in the classroom? I didn't have to be in the classroom because the classroom, I couldn't acquire the knowledge without the teacher. No, I had to be in the classroom for one simple reason: is if I'm not sitting in the room, then the school doesn't get the money associated, because how much money they get every day is a function of how many students are in that seat at the classroom. So that's the only reason why they want you to sit in this classroom, is because they don't get the money if you're not sitting in the classroom. So they want to take attendance, making sure, I cut as many days as I could, to the point in time where if I cut more, I would not have graduated. So I cut the maximum amount of days, that I was entitled to cut, and without putting at risk, graduating. But if not, I would have cut every day. So, because I at the end of the day, I wasn't paying attention to teachers, because I like learning on my own, and I didn't need the teachers to teach me the stuff that, that I was interested in. I put the effort in learning on my own. So what happened? The teachers all wanted to give me bad grades, no matter how well I tested, because they would say I was disruptive to the class, or I didn't do well in class participation, because when the teachers would say, put the book down and, or stop doing your logic puzzles there, I would say I have an obligation to sit in the seat. I don't have an obligation to listen to you. So there was no one could force me to
listen, Jeffrey. I'm not talking about that kind of education.
But,
I mean the education side.
How do we have a failure in the design of curriculums?
Yeah.
How many schools, how many teachers are really capable of helping people develop good cognitive skills?
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, I believe in education and people developing knowledge and cognitive skills. People who have the capacity of being good at problem solving. People who can't get fooled by these arguments, like Trump, like right now when he says, "Oh, they're setting these people." Everybody knows, okay. The reality is these judges are not talking about putting the people back on the streets. They're talking about is just respecting the due process, and after that, deporting them. Just follow the law. They're not talking about don't deporting them. They're just saying give them due process, then deport them, as opposed to deporting them without due process. That's all we're talking about. They're not talking about freeing them. No, has any judge said, I want all these people out on the streets? Okay, so no, they want them to. The judge's rulings are very simple. Give them time to notify their lawyers, okay, and defend themselves, okay? Enough notification before you send them out. That's all they're asking for. And look how and so how stupid a person do you have to be to believe this argument? I mean, how cognitive, the type of cognitive dissonance of being able to then distract people with bullshit arguments that have nothing to do with the reality. Anyone who had any decent cognitive skills would say, no, this is the Trump weave, okay? Or somebody else's version of their own version of the weave of being able to say things that have nothing to do, with the. I have a very simple example of a cognitive. I used to give cognitive tests to traders. So, and one of the questions, a simple question is, I'd say, okay, I'm going to this store and I see a lamp I like, and I'm told the lamp is $200. And somebody in the store tells me, there's a store 3 blocks away that has the same lamp for $175. So then the question is do you walk 3 blocks to buy it at the other's location? Then there's a different question is, I'm going to buy a sofa and I'm going to spend $10,000 for that sofa. Okay. And then someone tells me I got another place that has the same sofa for $9,975 3 blocks away. Now, people might think about that as two different questions, but they're really the same question. What's the question? Am I willing to walk 3 blocks to save $25? Okay. So I'm giving facts that are meant to confuse people, but someone who has good cognitive skills will recognize most people will think in terms of percentages. Okay. $25 on $200 is a higher percentage, but we don't spend percentages. We spend dollars. Okay. Percentages are irrelevant to how well we spend dollars. Okay. So the real question is I'm giving people information. And then the question is, can people recognize what the real question is with the information I provided? Will I walk 3 blocks to save $25? Because if I should be equally willing to, the answer should be the same for both the going to the sofa or the lamp. But most people will walk the 3 blocks to buy the lamp for $25 cheaper, but they won't walk the 3 blocks to buy the sofa $25 cheaper. Okay, because they think the question is a different question. No, it's the same question framed differently. And because people don't have the cognitive skills to understand that it's the same question framed differently, okay, they come up with an answer that's inconsistent with really the fact is they're walking 3 blocks to save $25. That's it. So the question is how flawed are our cognitive skills? If our cognitive skills are good, we can't get fooled by this bullshit. Okay, so we don't really have an education system that teaches people to think. And so, yes, I agree with you. If we had an education system, we had qualified teachers who themselves were qualified to teach people to think, rather than people who got an exam that that know how to educate, know how to indoctrinate people to pass an exam, but doesn't necessarily graduate people with with any real strong set of cognitive skills. So that I don't know if we could design a system that would accomplish that.
Well,
I
that
don't.
may be true. I mean, it may be Jeffrey, that that the best we can do is just have individuals, people like you and me. I don't want to be vain, just in our private capacities, create private schools and just say you don't have to pay, but you're going to get flunked out unless you do your homework, and leave that to the private sector people who have the understanding that if we don't hang together, we're going to hang separately without any brains. Because you don't have to have education entrusted to the government. It can be done privately in the family, home, in private institutions, and maybe that's the optimal that we can hope for, because the government always attracts sociopaths no matter what you try. Philosophers don't get attracted to government, and so no matter what the good goal of education is, it always be corrupted, and it'd be back to square one.
So what is that education? Rote learning, okay? Indoctrination and rote learning. Remember full dates, remember a few names, okay? And I don't know, how many people do you run across that you think have really exceptional, really above average cognitive skills? So not many. Most people, it's just the majority. Most people have mediocre cognitive skills, and most people put limited effort in developing their cognitive skills. They don't challenge themselves to be able to think better and to think independently. So because we also value our social relationships very highly. So if we want to think like the crowd that the group that we want to be a part of, and then people engage in a lot of preference falsification because they want to be part of a group and they think this is the cool group to be in, and this is the way they have to behave to be part of that cool group. Even if they really know better, because that's their psychic needs. So you have to be you can be a passionate person, but you also have to be a very dispassionate thinker. And I think people bring their emotion into their cognitive processes, and they can't really separate out and compartmentalize their feelings from their thoughts, and so that leads into a lack of enlightenment thinking. So
I call it Jeffrey's species narcissism. You got to take off no species narcissism. You got to look at the facts and experience without any blinders, no squinting, even if it's unflattering. But one of the things I oftentimes encounter is, say, Bruce, why do you keep asking why? I said, listen, because until you get to why, you don't know whether you should go down the route of how. I said, at one time men said women were witches and burned them. You got to always ask why. And you should never, ever accept anything just because, even if it's been around 1,000 years, 2,000 years. So, well, it could be wrong. Look at how many thousands of years we thought that the Earth was the center of the universe. We got Copernicus and we got Galileo. Anything could be wrong because human beings are not flawless. We're not omniscient. It's not in order to be rebellious or to be nasty. It's just a check that we don't want to keep going down the wrong path because we never asked, why is this correct? Is it the right way to do it? Is there an alternate way? Is there a better way? And that, unfortunately, that should be inculcated not only in schools and the home and the pulpit and synagogues and mosques, everywhere. But people want simple answers to complex questions, right? Yeah. And as H.L. Mencken said, yep, they're simple answers to complex questions. They're all wrong, right?
Your point, I've thought about the idea of like how the problem with trying to get, you think we have the technology that really our classroom experience should not be limited to geography. Yeah. So we really just need a small universe of superstar teachers who could then educate the world, because we have the technology for doing that. The problem is, could you create that school and have it certified so that so that when you graduate from that school, that your diploma is recognized for you to get to college and then to get to graduate school. So again, you still have the government involved because you have the certification process. And the question is, you can get the greatest superstar teachers in a room who might not have been taking the course of being a certified teacher. So because they're certified, they're not a certified teacher. Like you could know the Constitution a lot better than someone who's trained to give a course in constitutional law, but because you didn't go through the teacher certification process, you can't teach anywhere because that institution could not get certified, and then the people who go there feel they're wasting their money because they've accumulated knowledge. But then when they want to go to the next level, they go to a school where they say, well, I wasn't taught by so and so, but I didn't. Where did I get my my education? Like for me, when I started making a little bit of money, there were a lot of things I wanted to learn. So when I saw that a lot of things I wanted to learn, I would hire professors. I wanted to learn physics from Edward Teller and Richard Feynman. So can I say, did I get an accredited degree in physics? No, I didn't. But I paid to be tutored by Nobel Prize winners and physicists that I think people would have liked to have had education. And I've done this in other areas where I have an intellectual curiosity about something. So I hired somebody to basically be a private tutor in something outside of my field that I did go to school at, for finance and economics, other things that I wanted to learn outside finance and economics that I just wanted to learn for curiosity. And I didn't want to go back to school. I wanted to hire somebody who was the best at that field, who also knew how to teach somebody, mentor somebody, and basically all I wanted to do was tell me what I should read. And then they were there to answer all the questions I had for things I didn't understand. And, hopefully I would be able to understand their explanation of the things that I couldn't understand on my own from the reading I did. So to be really educated is an active process. It's not a passive process, not sitting in a classroom, taking notes, and then taking an exam when you're regurgitating the notes, where all you're doing is reviewing those notes, taking the notes, and then, I have to tell you, I was an adjunct professor, at a school, for 2 years. And one of the first things I would do with my class coming in, I'd say, tell me what your best class was the last semester, okay? So they would tell me their best class. So I started asking the question about material they learned in their last thing. So most of them had forgotten almost everything they learned because they only learned for the exam. They didn't really learn to learn. They learned to pass an exam. And then, and then I would ask questions like in finance. I'd ask questions like, okay, how do you create convexity? Okay. So, for bond trading. And then people would give me the definition. I said, I'm not asking you the definition. I understand you could recite and regurgitate the definition. Now apply it for me. Tell me, I don't want to hear how to calculate it. I don't want to hear the definition. Okay. I want to tell me, how can you create a portfolio that has convexity to it? And can you target a convexity? And nobody knew the answer. So just so happened, as I was asking the question, the professor who taught options walked by the door of the classroom I was taking, and I called him in. And I asked the teacher the question. He didn't know the answer to the question. Okay. Yes, he read a book. He knows how to do all the calculations, but he had no idea how to apply it. Okay. So the students had no idea to apply it. So that's worth it. Oh, gee, I can go to an exam and say, oh, gee, how to calculate convexity? Well, convexity is this. And I can sound very nice. But the question is, if you don't know how to create it, okay, you don't know how to reproduce it in the marketplace, then it's useless. So, I mean, this is why I basically just tried to self-educate myself, because I didn't think I had a lot of smart teachers, and they weren't answering that. If you really want depth of understanding, as opposed to just wanting to pass an exam, the education system is not designed for people who want to understand things deeply.
No, what I've done, Jeffrey, for the audience here, a little bit of, I don't know what to call self-promotion. I put up on my website, it's www.lawofficeofbrucefein.com, a reading list, 100-book reading list that everyone, if you want to be education, should master. It covers the waterfront from history and religion and math and a whole host of other subjects, philosophy. And then I have my 10 commandments, which I think are an improvement because they're more affirmative obligations than the commandments you receive in the Bible, which are mostly negative commandments, like never miss an opportunity to display kindness and wisdom towards others. Anyway, that's a start. And it doesn't cost anything. It's right there available. It's not flawless. I'm sure you could add or subtract a couple of the books that I mentioned. But as you're pointing out, Jeffrey, in this digital age, you can get virtually everything without paying an Ivy League tuition for it. It's really all on the internet. It's just being discriminating and knowing what to retrieve and read and examine and what to show and ignore because it's just chaff. It's not the wheat. And right now, so much of the stuff is chaff that you can ignore. It's drivel. But the gold nuggets are still there. And people know who've educated themselves what the gold nuggets are. Just go ahead, download it. Virtually all of the books are out of copyright, so it doesn't cost anything either. You get them on Kindle with a couple bucks.
So I encourage everyone watching or listening to this podcast to go out and look at Bruce's 100 books that he recommends to have a robust education, and begin reading and challenge yourself to read these. So people should want to invest in their own human capital, and if you care about, if you want to put America first, then you want to put the Constitution first. So that's the only way to put America first, is by putting the Constitution first. So check out Bruce's list and read everything he recommends you should read. So I checked out the list myself, and I've read most of the 100 books he suggested, not all of them. So, but I think within 2 years, I will, of the books I haven't read that of his 100 list, I will read. It's just that I have others I want to read as well that are not on his list, for different interests that I have in reading. So, Bruce, what would like your final words to be before you go out and enjoy the rest of your Memorial Day?
Well, I want to underscore, because the expectation, the optic is so warped and partisan, that I believe, Jeffrey, you and I, obviously we talk about things in current events, and it happens Mr. Trump is the president. But we would be saying the same things against Mr. Biden, against a Democrat, Republican, or independent. This is not an effort to slam any particular party or person. It happens that people who are in office and are doing wrong things, they're subject to attack. But it's not because of the personality. It's because of the attack on the system of the Constitution. And I can guarantee you, Democrats do stupid things. We'll say the same. I mean, I drafted articles of impeachment against Joe Biden, against Clinton, against Obama for illegal wars. I've done them against Bush and Cheney and others because they're flouting the Constitution. And we have to get over this partisan divide. What unifies us, as Jeffrey said, is the Constitution, the process. And we subordinate all other endeavors to that common recognition that if we all hang together on process, we can defeat everything. We'll learn by trial and error, but we stick to the process. We don't become enemies of each other. That's what I have to say.
Excellent, Bruce. Well, thank you so much.
Okay.
Have a great day.
Okay. Bye. See you soon. Thanks, Jeffrey.